Hello, Tubby and Coos fans. My name is Candace, the owner of Tubby and Coos, coming at you live from the bookstore for this author event today, which I am very excited about because it is spooky season, and this book is like the perfect book to read during spooky season. So I'm really, really excited today. And so I am speaking with Kat Ward, who was born in Washington, D.C., grew up in the U.S., Kenya, Madagascar, Yemen, and Morocco. She studied English at Oxford and later the Creative Writing Masters at the University of East Anglia. She won the August Derleth Award for Best Horror Novel for her debut, which was The Girl from Raw Blood, and again for her next book, Little Eve, which made her the first woman to win that award twice, which is very cool. Little Eve also won the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel and is published by Nightfire. And today we discuss her newest novel, The Last House on Needless Street, which is super, super weird and spooky. And I'm so excited to talk to her about it. So welcome, Kat. Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me, Candace.
Oh, yes. Thank you for being here. I am going to tell the audience, too, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we will definitely get to them as well at some point. So let's start off by, if you can tell the audience like something about yourself that is interesting that they may not know. Fun facts.
Okay. So this is actually sort of how I got into horror, actually, as well. So it's less of a fact and more of a short story. You never get a novelist talking. It's like you'll never hear the end of it. But so when I was about 13, we had this you read out all those places where I lived, and we moved around like every 3 years. But the one place we used to go back to was Dartmoor, which is very beautiful. It looks a bit like Scotland. It's got wild ponies. It's very bleak, and there's the ruins of like Bronze Age villages all over the hillsides, and there's bogs. I mean, it's just very kind of old country. And we came back to the same cottage every summer. And when I was about 13, something started happening, which is that I would wake up in the middle of the night with a hand in the small of my back, pushing me very firmly out of bed. And I could feel every finger on this hand, like it was very, very corporeal. And I used to fall, and I fell out of bed. And then I would go and I would just sleep on the floor in my sister's room. I never told an adult. I mean, I think that's sort of what it's like being a teenager. Is everything's so weird that it didn't seem any more strange or frightening than some of the other things that are going on in your life at that time. And it probably was the most frightened I've ever been. And I remember reading my first kind of uncanny, eerie ghost story, which is The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. And I remember thinking that feeling again, and thinking, this is where you put that. This is the cage. This is the architecture for that fear. And it wasn't until I got into my 20s and Google came along that I learned what it was. Because obviously, for me, that was a ghost. Of course it was. That's me seeing a ghost. It's actually something called a hypnagogic hallucination, which is where on the cusp of sleep, between sleeping and waking, you experience these extremely vivid hallucinations that are very tactile, very oral, very, very visual. And it's just it was sort of my gateway into writing this kind of fiction. And when I finally, opened my laptop or, picked up a pen years later to write, that feeling was what I wanted to convey and what I wanted to come out. And I thought I'd forgotten all about this, but it obviously lodged itself quite deep in my psyche. So that's a little potted story of like, what I think how I came to write the things that I write, really, although as it turns out, slightly on a misunderstanding of what that experience was. But that seems quite horror in itself, in a way, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And like, even if it was a different experience than what you thought, it still frightened you. Like it's still really creepy. It's still really scary.
I think that's exactly right. Like, it doesn't really matter what it was. It's the feeling that it gave you, because we don't feel that afraid in the daylight, do we?
No, we definitely do not.
No.
I don't know, maybe sometimes, but for sure it's mostly the dark.
Yeah, it's that sort of like, that really primeval fear that fear of the dark at the back of the cave.
Yes, exactly. So, for those who have not read this book yet, because it did just come out not too long ago, can you tell us a little bit about the book? I mean, we don't want to get too spoilery. This book has a lot of twists and turns, but just like what is this book about?
Generally, yeah. Okay, so The Last House on Needle Street is about Ted, who's a very lonely, reclusive, strange man who lives in a windows boarded up house at the end of Needle Street, with his 12-year-old daughter Lauren and his extremely disapproving, gay, Bible reading, talking cat Olivia. And I always saying, like, the cat is a real litmus test for the book. If you get past chapter 2 with the talking cat, this is the book for you. If you don't make it that far, then perhaps it's a sign that you should look elsewhere. But children have been going missing in this area for some time, and Needle Street sort of abuts on this great wild Pacific Northwest forest. As you know, that's that sort of land that can eat people alive. Really, people can just disappear into it, and have done. So the children have been going missing, and a particular young woman named Dee comes to believe that Ted is responsible for her sister's disappearance at a nearby lake some years ago. So she moves into the house next door to Ted's, essentially like to start surveillance on him and to figure out, by watching him, whether he might indeed be the culprit, and in fact whether perhaps Lauren, his daughter, is more than she might appear to be. And then finally, the sort of catalyst for things turning terrifying is that Lauren herself, Ted's daughter, goes missing, and events unfold from there. I think that avoided the spoilers just about.
Yes, that was very good, and avoided all the major spoilers. So yes, and that was great. And this book is extremely unsettling, which is a big compliment because it's supposed to be. It is so unsettling, and like you don't believe anything anyone says, and no one is what they seem in this book. Like not even the cat. Like nothing is what it seems. So talk about that, I guess, and what gave you the idea for this book in particular, and what are some of the tools that you use to create such an unsettling atmosphere and unreliable narrators?
I mean, I think so. I mean, this book started just initially. The very first spark of the idea was a little different to how it actually turned out. I've always been very fascinated by serial killers and their pets, because I think there's something so disturbing and almost revolting about an animal being forced to love someone who is very dangerous, and also the strong bond that a person without affect or empathy seems able to form with the animal, which, while paradoxically, as we know, quite often people start, the way they start to escalate is by harming animals. So it seems doubly kind of counterintuitive, and yet it's true. So Dennis Nielsen, who is, for those, who's an English serial killer who during the 70s and 80s used to prey upon and eat vulnerable young men, is a prime example. He had a dog called Bleep, and all he cared about when he got arrested was the dog. He couldn't really have given a crap about anything else, really. He just cared about whether the dog was okay. And Myra Hindley had a dog called Poppet, she was obsessed with. And in fact, there's an awful story about Poppet. So he, I don't know if you know the Moors murderers were, the way that they found the graves of a lot of the victims is that there were all these pictures of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley standing on various bits of moorland, looking quite like triumphant. And they worked out that perhaps these pictures had significance. And the dog was in some of them, but they didn't know how. In order to date the pictures, they had to date the dog, and they didn't know how old the dog was. So essentially, they put the dog to sleep and subjected it to like a test, almost like a carbon dating test. And they found out how old the dog was. Unfortunately, Poppet did not make it through the process and died. And Myra Hindley was just distraught. She couldn't have been more upset. So this is a contradiction for me that I always find fascinating, and it also seems so horrible. As I said, like domesticity comes to seem like another form of coercion and and forcing people to do some and control. So I started writing about that, but it became really clear to me quite early on that actually there was a much larger story to be told, about trauma and about survival. So I started researching the effects of trauma and how people get through situations like the ones that I wanted to portray. And what I found was just so, for me, awe-inspiring. And I hope some of my awe makes its way into the book, really, because it's what the resilience of the human mind is almost unbelievable, really, and the way that people can survive and even thrive in situations where they shouldn't be able to is kind of humbling, for want of a better word. So I knew when I found the spine, that was the spine of the book, and I found that. And then, of course, the next thing, as you say, is like, how do you frame it? Like, how do you write the unwritable? How do you take the reader so close into these characters, and render these things on the page that are sort of unthinkable, let alone unwritable? And the way that one book that really helped me kind of sort of have an idea of how to do that was Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates, which is her sort of fictionalized account of Jeffrey Dahmer. And it's very gothic. I mean, no one does gothic like Joyce Carol Oates. So it manages to use all these gothic tactics of like omission and redaction to tell a story. So it's all just as much about the absences as it is about the about what you're writing. And also, you wear him like a skin. You really do. You're so close into the perspectives that it really unnerves you, because the whole thing about fiction is we read fiction because it has to make more sense than life. It has rules, it has character development. You have usually a good authorial steer on how you're supposed to feel about things, and you can sort of go to it for a logic that life quite notably lacks. But if you go that deep into a perspective, and you do go so deep into a character's like a point of view, all those things go away. You're just as at sea and rudderless as you are in the here and now outside fiction, which I think is really disorientating. And I think that's part of the effect that you're talking about, in that the normal rules don't apply because you're so deep in someone's head that you don't have any of that comforting objectivity, that comforting fictional objectivity. And I thought that was, I keep I keep referring back to this metaphor of like wearing characters like a skin, but that is exactly what I wanted, is to be so deeply placed in their minds that actually the reader feels quite unsafe. And that's also a very almost quite a gothic thing to do as well, is take the minute focus and render everything in detail, because anything looked at for long enough becomes almost hideous and frightening in itself, doesn't it? Like anything examined closely and for long enough becomes sort of dissociative and unanchored from its meaning. So that was what I wanted to do, was kind of make it a dizzying, almost like exercise in defamiliarization, while telling a story about a talking cat. Which is,
I think you did that very successfully.
Thank you.
And you're right. I think what makes this book so unsettling is that it is like, you do feel unsafe. It doesn't follow, like what you think. Like it doesn't, it doesn't take you on the journey you think you're going on. And it makes it really unsettling. Was it hard for you to be in this headspace for this long writing this book?
Definitely. I mean, it's not a nice world to spend a huge amount of time in, and it's there are some. In fact, there's one part of it where I just actually couldn't write it. So like it was the draft was due to my agent, and I just was sitting there, and there was a hole in the manuscript where this scene had to go. I think no spoiler, but if I just say the word vinegar, like I think people who've read it will understand what part I'm talking about. And I couldn't do it. And it was literally hours to go, and I hadn't written it, and I knew exactly what it had to do, what it had to be. I knew what it had to contain. I just couldn't do it. It was too horrible. But I did, obviously. But it's strange. Like it's a strange sort of push pull impulse that you get with horror, whereby horror writers are writing, I think hopefully they should be anyway, writing what horrifies and frightens them. So they're, they are both compelled to, and also really feel deep resistance to writing these things at the same time, which is just such a weird dynamic, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, it really is a weird dynamic.
Yeah.
And I do always wonder that about horror writers, like, is it hard for you to write some of this stuff? And I feel like it would be, especially if you are writing what scares you, right? Then it seems like it would be a little bit difficult.
You have to make yourself vulnerable, otherwise there's no point in doing it. And I know, I mean, also it's, I'm sure you found this too, but like horror people are in general, the kindest, most moral, upright, gentle, easy, sensitive group you'll ever come across. And it's that strange contradiction whereby they summon these things from the deep. It's really it's like an act of sort of self-flagellation, really.
Yeah, for sure. And we've talked about the main characters in this book. So it's told from 3 main points of view. Ted, who is like this loner, he's got undiagnosed mental issues. He lives with his cat and his daughter, who comes. And then we have Dee, who moves into the house next door. She's on this quest to find her sister who went missing years ago. She thinks Ted has something to do with it. And then we have Olivia, Ted's cat. So tell us a little bit more about how these characters came about to have their own points of view in the story.
I mean, there's sort of I think particularly for Olivia, I think I think I was saying to you earlier before we started, like she becomes, and I didn't expect this to happen, she becomes like the moral center of the book, really. And I had no idea, I had no idea that was going to happen. But so she performs for Ted, I think. She performs, actually, to be honest, which the function a lot of us get from our cats, which is she's like a comfort animal, really. She becomes a repository as soon as he touches her, all his fears and the horror recedes, and she takes it on. She becomes a sort of receptacle for it. And it's, I think anyone who has an animal is familiar with this. Is the moment you're in their presence, they just ease the whole thing. And what was funny is when I was writing it, she came to perform almost exactly the same function for me as a writer. Like I looked forward to writing her. As we were saying, it's not always an easy place to spend your days, Needless Street, and I just loved writing her. It was a real moment of light coming into the into the dark wood, and I think she comes to perform the same function for the reader as well. So it's like sort of like on all 3 levels. She's just a cat that stalks through all the levels, comforting everyone. But her voice was really difficult to get right because I didn't want it to be cute, didn't want it to be like sentimental or like cozy, and it's difficult to get not to do, I think. So there were 2 things that helped me get it. One is I absolutely love David Sedaris's short fiction and essays, and I just thought she probably thinks and talks a little bit like David Sedaris at his most acerbic. And that was nice for me, to channel a sort of different genre in a way, to bring that in and try something which my horror and uncanny and sort of like my kind of darker fiction roots hadn't yet tested me on. So that was nice. And I also just, the moment I knew I got her was when I realized that what she'd really like to do, spend her days doing, is watching a TV show about herself describing different kinds of naps. And I thought, well, that's it, isn't it? That's the, like, you have like a little key into each character. And that was the one into her. And with Ted, it was a little different. It's a little difficult because, I mean, he's a very damaged human being, and you want to write, but you also have to make sure that you're not coming down one side. You don't want to present him as one-sided, is what I'm saying. He has to be multifaceted, and whatever he is or is not, he's equally as much himself when he's describing like eccentric recipes as he is when he's in different phases, in different sort of states. But I also felt like there was certainly, I wanted to use, and I'm being careful here, I wanted to use certain horror tactics that I've seen widely, seen abounding in stories and in film in particular, I don't think are very necessary. And I wanted to use use Ted's character as a way to talk about those horror tropes, if you will. Is that I'm sounding so mysterious, but do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I think if people read the book, they will understand what you're saying.
Yes,
this
is all exactly. This is all only going to make
Just
sense
read
if you
the
read
book,
the entire
everyone.
book.
And what about Dee?
Oh well, your heart just breaks for her, really. Like, she's some. I think we've all had. And no one, unfortunately, in this world reaches a certain age without having encountered grief and loss, and it has the capacity to blight your life completely. You can, and some people never really get out from under it. And I think that's her narrative, is that she spent her whole life trying to atone for the loss of her sister. But it wasn't her fault. It wasn't her fault. Her sister went missing at the lake, but it's the guilt one feels in those situations is huge. Survivor's guilt. So again, someone whose purpose is by loss in the past. Again, it's a very painful place to write from. But she's also incredibly resourceful. She's very brave, and she kind of plays the book's inner detective. She's the one who is the audience surrogate of, like, let's find out what's going on. Let's go in. And although every single one of the characters has a secret, and each one of them kind of, that secret becomes a fatal secret. For each of them in different ways as they go on. But I think she's probably your most kind of like your most direct way into the mystery, I think. As a reader, she is like she is like the playing detective, putting the pieces together. But yeah, it's again horrible because you have to go into it. You have to go into those feelings, and it's quite a it's quite a dark place to spend your writer days. But I think she's I've seen, I think we've all known people like that who never really got over a loss.
Absolutely. And I agree that she is the reader's sort of way in. I totally agree with that, because, like, kind of from the beginning, like, you don't know what's up with Ted. He's like,
with anything.
That weird stuff. There's like green boys in his attic. There's like all this weird stuff going on with him that you're like, I don't know about you, and then you have the talking cat who is like such a novelty, right? Because it's a talking cat. And then you get to Dee, and Dee is just trying to figure out what's going on. And so I totally agree that she's like the reader's sort of surrogate in this book of like, what is going on with all of this?
I was talking to Gillian. This is so grand of me, isn't it? I was talking to Gillian Flynn. I did an event with her, and we were talking about this exact thing, which is that, and she was like, I always feel like I have to use something really grounding at the beginning, because basically later some really grand guignol shit's going to go down, and like, and I think that's true. Is you can't subsume the reader in kind of magical realism kind of chaos without some kind of anchoring things as well, and also to give them someone to be like, to get behind and like follow the clues with. And it should be a two-way street. You should be like a reciprocal process where the reader's as involved.
Sure. And she, you don't get to her for a couple chapters, like you have to get through Ted, you have to get through Olivia before you get to Dee.
That's true. I think many people give this book up at that point.
But I think it's good if you do, like you're saying, if you can get past Olivia, the talking cat, then you're good to go. The beginning of this, the whole book is really creepy, but you're just immediately in that starting with Ted, you're just immediately in that weird space. And so let's talk about mental health in this book, because everyone in this book suffers from some kind of mental health issue. There are multiple characters suffering from dissociative identity disorder. So why does mental health play such a huge role in the book? Like, what were you hoping to accomplish with all that?
I think it's sort of what I was talking about with horror earlier. Like, I think that there may be a bit of a horror problem with talking about mental health. And I wondered if there was a way to use those expectations that are set up with the reader to do something a bit different, if you see what I mean. So, and I also, I think there's different types of horror. There's the horror of the supernatural, and there's the horror of the being chased through the woods by a maniac or whatever. But there's also the horror of, like, and I think this is a huge thing with mental health, is being afraid of what you are and what you might become. And I don't know anyone who doesn't have a slight suspicion, or anyone who I like anyway, who doesn't have a slight suspicion that they might be either a monster or capable of monstrous acts. And I think for people, it seems like certainly two separate strands, but the way horror can sometimes treat people with mental health issues is like a fully formed monster already. And also, I think that your sense of instability, and your sense of like loss of control, can also lend yourself to be afraid of what perhaps you might be, because the ground is already shifting under your feet. So it seemed to me that was what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about and as you know, like, there are monsters in this book, but they may not be the ones you expect. So it's and that was sort of a huge part of what I wanted to accomplish, is like to maybe just shift the discussion a bit to the left,
Yeah, and I think that's really great, because I agree with you. In a lot of horror, the monster is, has, it's like, it's always the mental illness is why you're the monster. And that, that equation does, it just doesn't work. It's like, well, like you're saying, the way it treats mental illness is not great most of the time.
So I think that's right. And there's also it's a kind of a go-to, isn't it? That and I thought, and I spoke to someone who was talking about who'd been through some of the very specific situations I describe, and it's not based on anyone. Let me be very clear, but the specific kind of issues that they underwent were very similar to some of the things I describe in the book. And I was like, what would you like people to know about your situation that they don't know? And they said, well, several things that were very, very interesting. But one of them they also said is, every time I see or read anything about this sort of mental health trauma, it's never about us. It's always about us being some kind of like catalyst for like horror action. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So why don't we just write a book? Because you were saying, like, what drew me to it's full of mental health issues, this book. Yeah, but that's kind of what drew me to that subject matter as well. Is why don't we make it about the people who go through this, as opposed to using them as a tool, a jumping off point to provoke action.
Yeah, and you do a really good job with that, because one of the other things that you do in this book is you match the setting to the mental state of the characters, and it makes it all feel so much more creepy, because like everything is broken and dirty and old and like dilapidated. Yes. And it's like matching that mental state. And so can you talk about that a little, and like how did you do that in the writing process? Like, did that just come out? Did you have to go back and sort of edit to make the setting sort of match? I assume you did this on purpose? So that's
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, Ted has doesn't he? He has a diary of broken things that he takes around and he makes notes of everything that's broken in the house every week. And a lot of his whole life is this war of attrition of like trying to fix things as they break, which is a kind of I suppose an image of his inner mental state as well. I think also the forest is a huge part of that as well. Because you've got that sort of very closed in, very insular image, like a walled up house with peepholes in it is a kind of a perfect image of sort of interiority and the mind, isn't it? It's just also, we're all just, in a sense, we're all just peering out of peepholes, you know, at the world side. Yeah. And that, but with that set next to this great wild unknown that doesn't care about you, that, first of all, it's quite a sort of Gothic juxtaposition, isn't it? Like the containment, almost imprisonment, really, set against the sort of like, you know, anarchic, feral, almost like, and you know that forest, that kind of forest as well. That it's the only temperate rainforest in the world, I think, and it's got those Jurassic ferns that stand above your head. I mean, it everything about it says that it shouldn't exist. It's just, it's so it's just a little bit to the left, isn't it? It's just got that eerie quality, and also, you know, historically, it's got a terrible track record for serial killers as well. Like Washington State is probably, you know, it's been the hunting ground of, you know, probably more than its fair share. I mean, notably Ted Bundy. But so it's got you've got all those reverberations working in the setting. But I also felt like, you know, he has there's great pride he takes in his surroundings and his house, and I found that kind of almost heartbreaking as well, because even though it is run down and dirty, and you know, and everything's broken inside, you know, he still goes around every week trying to find things to fix, and he loves, you know, he it's a spiritual and kind of mental home for him, as well as a physical one. So yeah, I mean, also the home is like, it's such a powerful thing, isn't it? Because the home is where we're supposed to be safe. We're supposed to be safe at home. And you know, in this case, really not.
Yeah, no, we're not. You're not safe anywhere.
That's true.
That's one thing, I guess, most horror books, right? You're like, you're never
yes, exactly.
You kind of know this going in, that you're not going to be
exactly
safe.
But it seems like, you know, such a sort of egregious additional kick when you're down, as well as to make the one place where perhaps you might take, that's traditionally your refuge, to make that also just even more menacing than the rest.
Oh yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, for me personally, the creepiest horror is like home invasion kind of horror.
Yeah.
That, like, there was the movie from, like, I don't know if it was the 80s or the 90s, A Stranger Calls, with, like, you know, it's the person inside the house, right, with the babysitter.
Oh God, yeah. Is that Scream? Is that Scream?
So no, I think it's called A Stranger Calls.
Stranger Calls. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Is the first one, and it's the babysitter, and the person keeps calling and like terrorizing her, and then the twist is that the person's inside the house the whole time. Yeah, so it's like, oh, you know, the killer's inside the house. So that one I could handle. The second one is called A Stranger Calls Back. And in this one, the killer, like, they catch the killer at the end of the first one. The killer has been let out of jail and starts coming after her again, like years later, in the second one. And in this one, it's much more home invasion-y in that, like, the first one, it's just the twist. You don't know the killer's in the house the whole time. In the second one, the killer like paints themselves to look like the wall and is like up against the wall, and then like his eyes open. And like for years after I saw that, I, like, every single time when I came into my house, I'd have to turn lights on immediately. I'm like feeling the wall. Like, it freaked me out so much. So I just think that, yeah, like, your home, when you feel like your home isn't safe anymore, that's definitely a special kind of horror, when your safe place isn't safe. And for sure, that's this book.
Yeah, I know. It's so potent, isn't it? That idea, like the menace, and also the menace of like the domestic menace of, like, you don't know where. I think horror often relies, and this book is no exception, on you don't know where to put your fear. You don't know where the horror resides. And you know, the suspicion that it might be on the home is kind of doubly unnerving, really.
Yeah.
I'm not going to watch either of those two films. I'm far too much of a scaredy cat.
It's okay. I normally don't watch, like, I love horror books, but I hate horror movies. It's like something about like, I don't know, like I if I can like choose what to visualize and not, I guess like when I'm reading a book, I don't know, it's just a different experience. And so I can read horror books all day long, but like movies, the jump scares, and I'm just not into that.
And also, how do you feel about true crime?
You know, it's interesting. Like, so many people are so into true crime, and you know, I'm like sort of have like a passing interest in true crime. I got really into the podcast Serial, as many people did. That followed, you know, like where you don't know, and you know, the guy went to jail, and like you don't really know if he's guilty or not. There's a lot of doubt. So that kind of stuff is interesting, but I don't like, it's almost too real for me. Like, I don't know, like the world is shitty. And so like true crime just sort of reinforces that. And so I'd much rather fictional horror where it's like, I know this isn't real and it makes me feel better about it. So I don't know. Like, I will follow certain true crime stuff, but I don't get super into it like a lot of other people do.
So interesting, isn't it? Because people usually do fall into one camp or another. So I'm sort of the opposite. Is I can handle almost any amount of true crime, but the moment it's fictional horror, I'm so frightened. I actually can't really watch it. And I was talking to a psychotherapist friend of mine about this. Like, and particularly women as well. Why do people gravitate so much towards that? And she was like, well, you can do three things when you're confronted with like a threatening anomaly, which I think is like violent psychopathy is that, right? And she was like, you can either run away from it, or you can try and fight it, or you can make friends with it. And making friends with it is sort of what it sort of means, I think, is like almost familiarizing yourself with it, almost like arming yourself against that day when that in your mind almost, you know, inevitable day when you're going to be faced with the monster. And if you've read enough or like played with the feelings enough or practiced the feelings enough, then you're going to be prepared. You know, it's a strange thing. And sort of, I suppose the extreme example of it would be like women marrying violent offenders in prison, because it's a sort of strange like misfiring instinct of like trying to keep the enemy closer. I just thought that was interesting. I'd never thought about it that way before.
Yeah, I've never thought about that either. And it is interesting that you would try to get close to it to like prepare yourself, or to make sure that, you know,
if protect yourself.
Happens, to protect. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And it does make sense to a certain extent to me as well. Yeah, but real life stuff, I think, is just generally, I don't like any real life stuff. I would much rather be fictional. Again, like movies, I love like humorous horror, if that makes sense. So I can watch things like, you know,
like
The Army of Darkness,
word, like camp horror.
Exactly. Campy horror, or like Beetlejuice, love it. Addams Family, love it.
For sure.
You know, that kind of stuff, which isn't really horror really, but yeah, I can watch those kinds of movies and love them. But straight up horror, or I can watch really gory stuff.
Really?
Yeah, like, you know, like killers, you know, whatever. Because I'm just like, oh, it's all fake blood, like whatever.
Right.
That but like the creepy horror-y things, that's hard for me to watch. I would much rather read a book than do any of that. So yes, okay, so we've talked about characters and we've talked about setting. So let's talk about plot for a second. And we're not going to give anything away, but there are like a lot of twists and turns in this book. No one is what they seem. As a reader, you get the rug pulled out from you like over and over. There are lots of layers. So I'm just wondering, like, how did you plot this book? Did you have like a murder board behind you with like all the stuff and the strings and the like, there was so much, I feel like, to keep track of here, and layers. You know,
it's so interesting because I did try a murder board. I tried a murder board and it didn't work. I found that it just killed. It stopped, because a book is sort of like, it feels like a bit of a live scratching thing inside your head when you're doing it. At the moment I laid out the murder board, it went just dead and inert. It was really strange. It was, very unhelpful, because a murder board would have been super helpful. It really, the only way I could keep track of this, I found, was holding the entire thing inside my head whole, like a sort of glass palace, And every time you change one thing in this book, you have to change like 37 other things.
Yeah.
It's like, and the only way I found I could do it was just by holding it completely in my head. And I've never had that experience before. And I mean, it's so unhelpful that it would be this particular book that would be true for, which is the twistiest and the most labyrinthine. But yeah, it was, for some reason, all I could do was just sit with it. And it did become like a sort of mind palace thing where I was like, I was like running scenarios in my head of what if I change this and this and this and this. But it almost bent me in two some days, I have to say. It's like someone put it. It was like driving a team of octopuses down a busy thoroughfare. But yeah, it was difficult to plot. The thing is, I knew where I had to get, but I had almost no idea of how I was going to get there. So the whole thing was it felt really difficult. Like I would get up in the morning and start writing. I'd be like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if it's possible to do what I want to do. I don't know if I'm a good enough writer to do it. And so it's much more. I think you have a certain amount of that with every book you write. Anyway, at least the good ones you do. It's the ones where you're sure you're good that's where the problems start coming in. But I certainly, like, it felt dangerous every day, like getting up and sort of trying to do this sort of high wire act of high concept kind of storytelling. And it was a gesture also of kind of defiance as well, I think, because I think, you know, I went to I sort of went to book jail after my second book because it didn't do very well. Sometimes they don't. There's no way of explaining it. And I thought, you know, if I only get one more go at this, I'm going to make it the really mad, anarchic idea that I want to write, and not try and you know, write some kind of platonic ideal of a Gothic novel. Instead, just really anyway, as it turns out, this is the result. And I'm absolutely delighted that people seem to respond to it. But it certainly could not have called that, you know, this time last year at all.
Yeah, I was wondering, how has the reception? It's only been out maybe a week. I think it came out at the end of September here in the US, but it's been out in the UK since March, right?
Yeah.
So how has the reception been so far?
I mean, it's been doing surprisingly well. Like I said, you know, if I'd known all it took was to write a book about a religious gay talking cat, then I would have done it years ago.
I mean, duh.
If I'd known that this was the key. No, I mean, it's just, I think there's an argument to be made, and there are no guarantees of anything, but there is a real argument to be made for. There's no way to predict what people are going to want, what publishers are going to want, what agents are going to want, what the market's going to want. So write the book of your heart, however mad it may be, and that's probably the best. You know, that's probably the best way through this sort of like maze of doubt and fear that comes with all aspects of this business.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen King said he was blown away by this book, y'all. So just FYI, if you're a Stephen King fan, he loved this book. There's a quote on it from him. So I just wanted to mention that if you're still on the fence after hearing all of this, Stephen King loves this book. So
thank you. And that was a mad day. I was like, I love Stephen, because I've been reading Stephen King since my, you know, my childhood, and yeah, just that was extraordinary for me.
I bet it was awesome. You were like, oh my gosh.
And just like just wall to wall screaming.
Amazing. And yes, if anyone out there watching has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I haven't seen any yet, but if you drop your questions there, I will ask them, as long as they're appropriate. Let's say that. Not that I've ever gotten anything really inappropriate, but just
really.
Luckily I've not gotten anything. But yes, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. And I wanted to talk about like sort of the difference between this book and your other two, because your other two books are more like historical Gothic. And this book is quite different from the others, and it's more modern. So why did you make that switch?
I think you know, once you've done two of something, also I felt like I'd explored what I wanted to get from that. I've got a huge amount of time for the classic kind of ghost story narrative and the classic Gothic novel, really. but I think once you've done that twice or explored that so thoroughly, I felt like it was really time to do something new and something that tested me in a different way. I think, boy, did I choose something that tested me. But it also I feel like Needless Street is gothic in a lot of its tone, a lot of the way that it's told and its narrative. Like, what is gothic but the found footage of literature, really? It's all assembled bits of evidence put together, diaries and letters. And Needless Street is exactly that. It's got this sort of air of testimony, which the gothic relies on. Oh, bless you.
This is why I put myself on mute in case
bless you. And so I feel like it uses the same kind of huge range of expression, because I think the Gothic still has a lot to say. I think it's it's a way of talking about gender and power and all sorts of kind of like juxtapositions, of domesticity and wildness. And I think it's a really expressive genre. And God knows, if we feel like we've moved beyond those discussions, I think we're probably wrong. We more than ever, they're kind of really relevant. So I think I just felt like it was like lifting out these things which I'm so this kind of genre which I'm so passionate about, and just putting it in, I suppose, a really unexpected setting. That I thought would be really exciting, and I did find it, as I said, quite testing, but also very exciting.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, I would argue that this is definitely like a modern Gothic book, because and this sort of modern Gothic like genre, there's a lot of things going on in it. There's a lot of people that are sort of writing in this Gothic. I mean, just the fact that it's like I'm saying, everything's broken and dilapidated and dark. I mean, that's like a very Gothic setting generally. And it's an old house, and there's and then the things that are going on, like, I don't know, I would definitely say it's Gothic. It's just not the like historical Gothic that your other books were,
not the sort of like the standards kind of exactly. And but I also like I thought and my two first protagonists as well were like, and I think it's first of all very, very Gothic to have a young distressed girl running about on a moor as your protagonist, but also maybe there's a sort of sense that you, first of all, you feel for your first forays into fiction, you kind of use avatars of yourself as well. So you like stick to, perhaps not always, I mean, God knows there's as many ways to write a novel as there are to do anything else, but for me, maybe that's the reason why I stuck closer to it. It's just, it felt like there was an added sense of security. And writing a book is such an insecure, terrifying thing that if you stick to something where you're like, well, I definitely know what it's like to be this person, or at least in a sort of version of them, then you give yourself an anchor, as it were. And I just felt like maybe I didn't need that anchor anymore. And I wanted to tell a story from the point of view of, a very troubled man and his cat and his daughter and his neighbor.
Yeah, and this has been optioned for film, right?
Yes.
Like Andy Serkis, and has optioned it for film. Are you working on that? And like, who would you like to see get cast as these characters?
The thing is, it's a question I'd love to answer. I just can't answer that because when they're trying to hammer it out right now, I think, and you just don't want to.
I'm so curious to see how.
I know, me too.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I'm curious to see how Olivia gets done in this movie.
Oh, I know, but they're so wonderful. They were so passionate about it from the first, and they were the first to jump, and they were like, "We want this. We really, really want this." And I was a bit nervous because I'd never really sold a film option before, so I was like, "Oh God, I've got to get it right." And eventually, they got really fed up with me, and they were like, "We're just getting everyone on a call," and they got the entire company on this sort of 18-frame Zoom screen, and kind of just reassured me. And I was like, yes, okay, we can I think we can all agree this is the best route forward. I can't wait to see what they do with it. I think they're just exactly the right people to have charge of that,
Yes, that's awesome. So I can't wait to see it either. And are you like involved in any way?
Well, I mean, they're really nice, right? They gave me
Just
an
to make sure
executive
they get
producer.
it right is my you know.
I
That's
mean,
that's that's my concern.
I think they'll get it right, but I mean, so I asked for and was given an executive producer title, which is really uncommon actually. It basically what it does is it just gives me a seat at the table. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're going to take all my recommendations, but it means it's a dialogue, and I think that's actually very unusual for writers to be given that level of input,
Yeah.
and kind of collaborative, that collaborative dynamic. So for me, it's a dream come true, and they're just really. I mean, if you they are fire, there's fire in their bellies about this book, and that's the most you can ask for, really, whenever anyone's taking it on in that capacity.
Yeah, it's exciting. So I know you can't talk about it, but I just was like, this is exciting, and I'm excited to see how they do it all. Because I think it could be really good. It could be an awesome movie.
I think so too. I think so too. It's a challenge, but what
It is,
what
yeah.
good thing isn't a challenge?
Yeah, that's fair. And because there are also things that you can do in books that you can't do in movies. And
Yeah,
so that's another thing that's really interesting because it's like, well,
yeah,
there again, like no spoilers, but there are things that you can do in a book
yeah.
that you may not be able to do in a film as well. So but that it should be pretty cool once that is coming. So
Totally.
tell us about so you have a book coming out in March called Sundial.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that book.
Um. So Sundial is about Rob, a mother who comes to suspect that her daughter Callie has dangerous behavioral tendencies, and in fact is a danger to her younger sister. So she takes her back on this sort of mother-daughter bonding trip to Sundial, which is Rob's childhood home in the Mojave Desert. And Sundial is a kind of like a sort of abandoned facility. And when Rob was growing up with her twin sister there, they their parents did all sorts of experiments there on, and I'm really fascinated by the MK Ultra experiments in this, that the CIA did in the 60s and 70s. There are also some ones, the recently declassified ones, that are so crazy that I couldn't have made them up. And there was one in particular that I read about, and I was like, I have to use this in a book. So Rob takes her back to the sort of this place where they can talk, really. But when they're there, and she tells her about the past and the present interweave, and you suddenly see that perhaps they're not as unconnected as you might think. And it's but the main thing about it that I really wanted to accomplish was that Rob and Callie, the daughter, both come to suspect that the other means them harm. Basically, it's a mother and a daughter, isolated on a bonding trip, each thinking that the other one wants to kill them. And I just find, I find that all my novels talk about family and love and these really complex bonds. And I always think that mother-daughter, that bond in particular is so powerful. And there's so much to it that's not pretty or necessarily kind of socially acceptable, but it doesn't mean that it's not. It doesn't mean that it's not strong and incredibly kind of potent. So I wanted to look at that, and I don't know. I just find it really compelling, and really, as I said, like I've always got to be cautious, like cautiously proud of it. And but like all my books, it seems to be about perhaps horror and alienation, but actually it's kind of about love, in the end.
Yeah.
Perhaps along a strange route, but
And that one comes out in March.
yes, that
So
comes out in March
yeah,
from Nightfire.
that's a really quick turnaround from both of these books. They're getting published pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's just the publication dates that fell that way. Like, Sundial's been done for a year, really.
Mm,
It's just because Nightfire. I really wanted Nightfire. It's like fresh out the gate,
yeah.
just getting going. We just wanted to make sure that they had, that we were able to get on board with them, and that means waiting a little bit, and that's which I'm absolutely more than delighted we did, because they're amazing, and they've been the bee's knees, basically.
Yes, I have loved everything they've put out so far. They're doing such a great job, and they have some really, really good stuff. So yeah, check out Tor Nightfire books if you're out there, because they're all really great. And so what are you working on now that you can talk about?
Oh, yes. So I'm working on I've got a new book in the works for, God, this must be going up to 2023. Yes, March 2023. I don't want to say too much about it because I'm still dreaming it, you know. And I find that whatever you think you know about a book at an early stage always changes substantially. But in essence, it's about a man going back to a New England cottage to write a revenge novel about his dead rival. But perhaps the rival isn't as dead as he may seem.
Nice. And do you have any book recommendations for us, for the folks watching?
Ooh, yes, always. So what I really loved recently was Mrs. March by Virginia Fito. I think it's absolutely spellbinding. It's about a New York, I don't know if you're familiar.
Mm-mm.
It's about a New York socialite wife. It's just awful. Her husband puts her in a novel she doesn't read his novels anymore, so she only finds out when she goes to the local bakery and she overhears them talking about her. And he's put her in the novel as a prostitute who's so pathetic that the clients pay her, and then just don't sleep with her, just pay her out of pity. Anyway, this sets in train this sort of paranoid, understandably kind of like awful paranoid kind of train of thought, whereby you're not quite sure whether Mrs. March herself is really losing the plot, or whether in fact her husband might be something other than he seems. It's again, it's one of those things that I love, where you're looking through her, you're just looking out through her skin, like, and everything is so hyper real. You just don't know, and yet you don't know what's real and what's not. I thought it's absolutely masterful. I got real writer's envy when I was reading it. I was like, oh God, this is good. I always love, and will always, my most recommended book of all time is always Kelly Link's Get in Trouble. Always. It's just, it makes the real world seem the unreal, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And her world it seems like, you know, the true reality, which I think is such a masterful thing. And there's so much great kind of women in horror happening at the moment, like Cassandra Caws, Nothing But Black and Teeth is amazing. And Alma Katsu, I'm just finishing off her newest one, The Further, which I think is out next year, which is about a horror story set partly in the American Japanese internment camps, which incorporates a whole other level of horror, really. I just loved it. But yes, I mean, those would be my top picks, I think.
Awesome. And Miss March was the first one? That was the name of it?
Mrs. March.
Mrs. March. Okay.
Mrs. March. Yeah.
I'm gonna definitely have to look that one up.
Oh, it's fantastic.
And so where can people find you if they want to hear more, or like keep up with what you're doing?
Well, I'm terrible because I don't have a website, which I don't know why. It's just I just don't. But you can always find me at Catriona Award on Twitter, where I keep up an incessant barrage of useless information.
Which is what Twitter is for, really.
Right, for real. What else are you going to do? Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. This was really fun and a great conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm going to tell everyone to buy this book. If this conversation didn't make you want to buy this book, then it's probably not for you. But like, it has a hyper religious cat in it that talks. I mean, you can't really get cooler than that. And this is it. The Last House on Needless Street. There's the Stephen King right on the cover there. And there's the cat, Olivia, who I assume that's Olivia on the cover.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So yes, The Last House on Needless Street. You can get that. Hopefully, if you're watching this from us, Tubby and Cruz, you can go to our website and special order it. We have it in stock. It is like the perfect book for spooky season. So definitely buy that. Or if you have people in your life that really like spooky stuff, it would make a really great gift as well. So thank you so much, Kat, for being here and talking with me. And everybody pre-order the next book, Sundial, which comes out in March as well.
Do everything Candace says.
All the things.
Do everything she says. Oh, thank you so much for having me too. It's been such a pleasure. And it was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Take care. Bye.